Hi everyone, welcome to my messy studio. My name is Mark and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to take a close look at the graphic works of one of my favorite artists, Francisco Goya. I'm going to copy one of his etchings in pen and ink to see if I can learn something about the way he worked, and then see if I can apply those lessons to one of my own drawings. But first, since art history is so important to understanding the work we're copying, let's touch on the life and times of this remarkable artist. Francisco José de Goya y Luciente was born in 1746 in a small village near Zaragoza, and his earliest training was in the academy of José Luzán, an unremarkable provincial painter who had studied in Naples and worked in a somewhat antiquated Neapolitan Baroque style. Goya was not a prodigy like Velázquez and was slow in growth, not only technically but also in his artistic vision. After 2 unsuccessful attempts to win the competition at the Royal Academy of San Fernando, he then traveled to Rome, which at the time was a center of artistic education. There, Goya completed his training and returned to Spain, and was fortunate enough to marry into a very influential family of artists who helped him receive royal patronage. In 1775, he was given his first important commission to make tapestry designs for the Prince of Asturias, the future Charles IV. These playful decorative paintings, done in the fashionable Rococo style, reveal Goya's keen interest in everyday Spanish life. However, they're also stylistically derivative and suffer from a stiffness of execution, and to my mind, only faintly foreshadow the greatness to come. With the power of royal patronage behind him, Goya was elected to the Royal Academy of San Fernando in 1789, and upon succession of Charles IV to the throne, appointed painter to the king. Now the most important artist in Madrid, Goya received commissions from the highest ranks of the aristocracy and became acquainted with members of the Spanish Enlightenment. His portraits of the elite, though often formulaic, reveal Goya's augmented technical powers and visual inventiveness. They also reveal his sardonic nature, and I suspect that his less than flattering depictions of various fops and toffs, their faces etched with dullness and privilege, must have been a cause of consternation. The French Revolution sparked a wave of reactionary panic at the Spanish court, and in 1792, Goya, who was a supporter of liberalization, suddenly fell from grace. Banished from court, he left for Andalusia, where tragedy struck. Due to an unknown illness, he lost the ability to hear and speak. He returned to Madrid and regained royal favor, but his health never returned, nor did the prosperity and relative peace of previous years. Spain fell into turmoil with the Peninsular Wars, and atrocities, famine, and political repression followed. In response to the isolating nature of his illness and the ceaseless cavalcade of horrors around him, Goya became increasingly bitter and disillusioned. He began mining the depths of human cruelty, greed, and stupidity for inspiration, but his imagery went beyond scathing political and social satire that we see in such contemporaries as Thomas Rawlinson. It also turned inward, exploring nightmarish states of being that no artist would dare approach until the German Expressionist movement. Technically, Goya was also ahead of his time, working in a rapid, frenetic manner that also prefigured the riotous outburst of rule-breaking at the beginning of the 20th century. A series of 80 etchings titled Los Caprichos was the earliest of Goya's visual jeremiads, done soon after his illness. A journey into the abyss of abysmal human behavior, it is by turns derisive and earnest, tragic and comic, macabre and phantasmagoric. They are some of my favorite works by Goya, resonating with my own misanthropic inclinations, which is why I chose this image from the series to do my copy. This piece, titled, or perhaps just captioned, "Mama, Where Are You Going?", is one of his more enigmatic, with few visual cues as to its meaning, but perhaps thematically tied to Goya's condemnation of witchcraft and superstition. Not only is it seriously strange and dark, making it super fun to copy, but the mix of hatching strategies employed here make it a particularly useful window into the way Goya approached rendering. Let's take a close look at this image and consider how it was done and how to best approach the copy. Etching is a printmaking technique where a metal plate is coated with an acid-resistant varnish through which scratches are made with a metal stylus. The plate is then submerged into an acid bath, which etches lines in areas where the varnish has been scraped away. The freedom and spontaneity with which lines are created in this method means that etching shares a strong visual affinity with pen and ink, much more so than engraving, where lines are painstakingly created by carving grooves into a metal plate. This makes etching a particularly useful learning tool for those seeking to improve their pen and ink technique. There is a variety of line thicknesses here, and since my pen has a flexible nib, I'll probably be able to use a single pen for the entire copy. However, the lines in etching do not widen or shrink as they would in an engraving or some pen and ink drawings. So, while we do need to be able to put down lines of various thicknesses, we don't need a pen with a flexible nib. 2 or 3 pens of different thicknesses would work equally well. And if you don't have anything quite as fine as my Platinum 3776, which is a bit of an outlier in terms of nib fineness, just work bigger. An added complication is that, like all the etchings in this series, we see the use of aquatint. In this process, an artist applies semi-acid resistant resin to the metal plate, which, when etched, creates flat, wash-like effects. The aquatint in this plate is very subtle, with a light tone applied to everywhere except the body of the woman. There also might be some aquatint in some of the very darkest shadows, or it could be ink dabbed directly onto the plate. However they were done, these effects should be easily reproducible with a brush, but it does limit our ink choices here since we need to start with something waterproof. While the ink used in this print is black, it has some transparency and variation in value. Perhaps someone with better knowledge of etching can weigh in here on how this was done, since I only took 3 semesters of etching almost 30 years ago. But if memory serves me, line value can be controlled by inking the plate and then wiping certain areas more thoroughly to make them lighter. This gives the artist careful control over the value of the lines, with some lines being very faint and some lines being black. After some experimentation, I decided to use diluted Noodler's black in my pen, and in some areas where the lines need to go lighter, dip the pen in a little water, which temporarily lightens the line. I also have an additional super sneaky way of controlling the value of the lines. Believe it or not, most inks, whether they're designed for fountain pens or for dip pens, can be lightened slightly with a hard eraser. The effectiveness of this is dependent on the ink, the paper, and the eraser, so test this out before trying it on your actual copy. As for paper choice, it ended up being very tricky since we're looking for a combination of correct color, texture, and ink handling. In terms of color, the paper here is beige rather than white, which gives the piece a warmth and softness despite the disturbing theme. This is something to be considered when working with black ink. Sometimes working on stark white paper can create a very harsh effect, making it difficult to control values. Working on slightly tinted paper is often easier because it lowers the strong contrast in the drawing in much the same way as working with lighter inks. Texture is also something important to consider. Etched lines have an irregular edge to them since they're created through exposure to acid rather than being carved with a burin. Using a slightly textured paper can reproduce that effect, so ideally I'm looking for a surface with medium tooth. And lastly, we'll be using washes here, so we need a paper that is able to handle it. After experimenting with quite a few papers in my paper collection, I chose a very nice beige paper made by Canson, the Canson Mi-Tientes line with the color name Eggshell. The color is a little bit darker and warmer, but close enough, and the slight texture got me exactly the roughness of line I was looking for, and this paper happens to take wash fairly well. Now that we've arrived at what materials to use, let's take a look at Goya's hatching methods. One of the reasons I chose to include Goya's graphic works in this video series is that he works in a way that I haven't covered yet. In one of my older videos, I identified 3 broad categories of hatching. The first one being parallel hatching, where layers of closely placed lines are put down at the same angle. The second being cross hatching, where the artist puts down layers of lines at different angles. And the third, cross contour hatching, a way of working that has many variations, where lines are put down at various angles and curves that follow the form. There are also quite a few variations within each method of working, however, as there are a number of hybrid methods, where an artist will use more than one way of rendering to create an image. As I see it, Goya is using a hybrid method here, a combination of parallel hatching and cross contour hatching, which I'm going to call single directional contour hatch. In this method, the artist lays down hatching which follows the form, but in the subsequent hatching layer will lay down hatching in the same direction, rather than a different angle. Here's what I mean. In the case of a round object, such as a sphere, the strokes are going to curve to follow the form. This is the same stroke that I start with when doing cross-contour hatching. However, in the second layer, instead of selecting a different angle, I simply put down a layer of hatch in the same direction, and all subsequent layers, I'll do the same. This way of working, though slightly more complicated than parallel hatching, is far easier than cross-contour hatching because I don't constantly have to search out new angles of form-following strokes. Is it messier than cross-contour hatching? Generally, yes, but that assumes that you've perfected your cross-contour hatching, a difficult thing to do. So, while an experienced hand will make a cleaner drawing using cross-contour hatching, a beginner will find that this single-directional hatching will create a cleaner drawing every time. Plus, this way of working is a good stepping stone to getting cross-contour hatching right. Besides single-directional contour hatching, Goya employs a number of other mark-making methods. There are a few areas here and there that are cross-hatched, but there is also a considerable amount of stippling and dashing. I believe the huge variety of lines used by Goya for rendering really contribute to the chaotic energy here, and is one of the secrets to what makes this piece so powerful. But before we get to the copying process, please allow me a few seconds to tell you about my newest series of workshops titled Drawing the Head in Pen and Ink. Drawing the head is one of the more challenging things that artists have to tackle, and doing it in pen and ink, a medium that doesn't lend itself to correction, makes it even harder. This 3-hour online workshop will cover the basics of head construction in pen and ink and how to work without a pencil underdrawing. Then we'll cover rendering, particularly how to render facial features, including common mistakes that beginners make with rendering. Finally, I'm going to show you several simple effective hatching methods used by the masters to create convincing, realistic head drawings in pen and ink. This workshop will be great for those of you that have some experience with drawing the head but struggle to do so with pen and ink, or for those that already have some experience with head drawing in this challenging medium and simply wish to get better. For more information about my workshops, please visit my website. I've penciled in the drawing using a crisscross grid method to facilitate things, since the composition here is fairly complex. And I want to get the overall proportions just right. Now I'm going to start inking with my Platinum 3776 filled with Noodler's Black, diluted 50-50 with water. Every copy I've done in this series has had its respective challenges, and I think here the main difficulty is reproducing the agitated line work. Despite the chaotic rendering, the miraculous thing here is that nothing in the image feels messy, and you always sense the master's perfect confidence and control. This is because, in art, believe it or not, chaos tends to be repetitive, with an out-of-control artist being out of control in a single, often predictable way. For example, one of the things I noticed when starting outlining is that Goya actually rarely relies on long continuous lines to outline his forms, but often uses stippling, dashed lines, or leaves the line out entirely, using value to create separations between his shapes. And the rapid way he alternates between different kinds of contours is remarkable. You can tell that Goya is constantly thinking about the contour, never letting himself get lazy and repetitive. Usually before doing a copy, I like to first practice copying a few details in order to figure out what materials to use, and the order in which to do things. I might also practice areas I anticipate will cause me problems. This gives me confidence and prevents me from being overly timid when starting a copy. But another thing that I find helpful is to spend some time at the beginning working only on one area, as I'm doing here, usually starting on something that you know will be relatively simple. This will get your hand warmed up and give you the confidence to go further. I chose to start on the face of the bottom figure, since it was entirely linear. Getting the exact likeness was challenging to be sure, but I had a fairly detailed pencil underdrawing to guide me, so it wasn't terribly stressful. Here you see me dipping my brush in water to get a lighter line. Every pen will react differently to this, so this is something that needs to be tested ahead of time. The longer you hold the pen in the water, the lighter the line will be, and with some practice you'll get a sense of how long you need to keep the pen submerged. My pen, being a fairly dry writer, took its time returning to putting down a dark line, and I even had to expedite the process by drying up the nib with a paper towel, and then shaking the pen to force new ink down the ink channel. This is a very effective way of controlling line value, one that I used previously in my copy of Michelangelo's Satyr. By the way, you can also do the reverse, create a darker line by dipping the nib into a darker solution, or directly into the ink bottle. In the shadow under the arm of the bottom figure, Goya is using a very effective way of building strong darks with only 2 layers, by putting down hatching at very similar angles, like so. While I usually advise not to do this when cross-contour hatching, since it creates an uneven interference pattern, here it works because it's consistent with the rough nature of the single-directional contour hatching technique. The same method is used in a number of other areas, such as the dark sky in the upper left corner, and the patch of dark ground under the figures. This is another instance where we detect a calculating intellect behind the chaos, with Goya managing to conserve his layers with amazing efficiency, getting strong darks with a minimal number of layers. As I'm working on the central figure, I'd like to point out the miraculous way the scratchy, impressionistic strokes come together to make the woman's face. From a distance, these strokes look like eyes, lips, and noses, but up close, they're a complex combination of stippling, scribbling, and hatching that I really struggled with, failing to capture the likeness and the dazed facial expression. This may have been a good detail to practice, but I suspect that I wouldn't have been any closer in my 3rd, 10th, or even 20th attempt, with each one coming out slightly different. Not to excuse myself, but keep in mind that when copying, you don't really need to get things exactly right, so long as you're learning from the process. A more exact copy can be attained from tracing or projecting, but I chose to work freehand. Tracing is not drawing and has limited benefits in artistic training, so while my copy is less accurate, I got more out of it. The legs and butt of the top figure are rendered with a lighter line, so I've dipped my pen in water to dilute the ink. This area is quite complex anatomically and demonstrates just how well Goya understood human anatomy. It also shows the effectiveness of the single directional contour hatching in accurately and subtly depicting the human form. There are also touches of cross-contour hatching here, which shows that this rendering method can easily be combined with others. Another example of this is the way Goya combines stippling and hatching in the legs on this figure. This is something we'll talk more about when discussing what broad principles can be derived from the way Goya worked. Going back to my earlier point about the way Goya was selective in his placement of sharp contour lines, there are actually very few continuous lines in the legs I'm working on now, and I suspect that Goya may have put in the original contours either with stippling or a very broken line. This, besides the lighter value of the lines, helps the figure recede into the distance. The same approach is used on the figure on the right, with the contour of the back defined entirely with hatching. These kinds of soft diffused edges are a common practice in painting, but in a linear medium like etching, they're quite surprising. Goya really was thinking like a painter here, blurring and lightening edges on things that need to look farther away, and sharpening and darkening edges where they need to look closer. As I'm completing this copy, let's move beyond specifics and talk about what I think are the broad lessons that can be learned from copying Goya. The first lesson has to do with creating groupings of figures. The challenge is that you have to consider each figure individually while not losing sight of how they work together as a whole. This is no easy task, and Goya accomplishes it admirably, with each figure feeling solid and coherent, and yet working in unison with every other figure to complete the overall choreography. And the term choreography is very appropriate here, because this is the key. Grouped figures should work in unison to create a single thrust and direction. The action of one figure must lead into the action of the next, a push must turn into a pull, where one figure recedes, another must project, and so on. In this case, we feel this Frankenstein creature, composed of demons, a heavy-set woman, and a cat holding a parasol, start to twist and totter. So the lesson here is, when grouping figures, always be massing. Details are important, of course, but the overall mass of figures should be locked together in a single action. This is going to unify your composition and give it a dynamic sense of movement. The second lesson is something we've touched on before in my previous videos on Anders Zorn and Kate Kollwitz, that you can be very bold and expressive in your rendering techniques and still bring your drawing together into a coherent whole if you find ways to cheat. That cheating comes in several forms. The first is the use of tone paper, which lessens the contrast slightly, making it easier to create softer transitions. The second cheat is using an ink that is not completely black, which also lessens the contrast. The third is the use of the organizing force of washes. Here the use of aquatint is very subtle, but it's doing a tremendous job quieting the texture of the hatch marks in the background, making them recede in space, even when they're quite strong. This is a prime example of the way even a light wash can help tame your hatching and serves to unify and organize your composition. The third lesson is that a large variety of strokes adds energy to your drawings. In this image, we have short curly strokes, we have long straight strokes, we have squiggles, stipples, dashes, and everything in between. These serve many functions, defining form, texture, depth, and value. But beyond their practical purposes, these strokes are part of what makes this piece so electric. This is something that I don't implement enough and will strive to force myself to do in my future work. The combination of stippling and cross-hatching is particularly effective here, and something that I plan to use in future work. This hybrid is not original to Goya and is seen in many old master pen and ink drawings. What's interesting here is that the stipples manage to be used both to reinforce value, but also to define the texture of rough skin, an unusual choice. Lesson 4 is that shading doesn't have to be consistent for the drawing to be coherent and unified. What I mean by this is that Goya renders certain forms with a full range of value, with soft halftones, coarse shadows, reflected lights, etc., and also leaves certain things quite linear, and the etching feels fully realized and complete. Consider the face of the woman and the demon right to the left of her. While her face is rendered with a strong dark shadow on her cheek, the other face, which according to the light direction should be in shadow, is left almost entirely unshaded. I assume this was because Goya did not want to obscure the wicked facial expression, but he also understood that so long as a majority of the visual language in your composition is convincing, you can get away with areas of incoherence. Lesson 5 is that this hatching method, the single directional contour hatch, is awesome and something I should have covered a long time ago in my videos. Out of the various hatching methods, the easiest by far is the parallel hatching technique, and is the one I usually recommend to beginning students. But going from parallel hatching to cross-contour hatching, where the hatch marks have to follow the form, is a large leap. This way of working, where form is followed, but only in a single direction, is a great intermediate step. Furthermore, it's a very effective method of emphasizing foreshortening. Look at how the increased curvature of the hatch marks on the leg of the female figure makes that form dramatically project forward. Here is the completed copy. Again, the most difficult things to get right were the faces. If they were more tightly rendered, it would have been easier, but copying every single scratchy line here proved quite the challenge. However, the key to copying, unless you've been commissioned to make an exact reproduction, is not to create a perfect stroke-by-stroke replica. It's to think deeply about what art-making strategies were used to make the image, and to see if any of them can be applied to your own work. And the best way to see if any of the lessons learned from the copying actually stuck is to try doing a work of art in the same style. That's what I plan to do right now. Here is my drawing already penciled in, ready to ink. Taking my inspiration from Goya, I also worked from imagination and placed my figures in all kinds of unnatural poses, including the figure on the bottom whose twist is so extreme it would probably be torn in half in real life. Goya did preparatory work for this series, and a number of sketches have survived, done in ink wash, sometimes in black ink and sometimes in a lovely reddish-brown ink. In retrospect, I should have done some preparatory work as well, especially since it's been a while since I've tackled a multi-figure composition or even drawn figures from memory. My advice is, don't do what I did, which is to rush in and simply compose directly on the page without working out the composition in a smaller sketch. You'll get a better work of art out of it. While copying should be an essential part in the training of the beginning artist, the practice shouldn't stop when an artist has reached maturity. To drive home the point, here are a few of Goya's copies of Velázquez, done when he was already a master in his 30s. No matter what our age or degree of experience, we should always strive to improve as artists, whether it be at our understanding of the materials we use or our techniques. And to my mind, the act of copying is the best way to commune with artists from the past that we admire and wish to learn from, to ask questions, and to receive answers. I, for one, have been looking at Goya for over 3 decades and learned some new things from doing this copy, things which I hope to implement in my own work. While I tend to copy drawings in their entirety, there are tremendous benefits to copying details, particularly if you're looking to acquire a specific skill. For example, if you want to improve your skill at drawing hands, fill a page with hands from different old masters. You can also do compositional studies of paintings, where you focus on basic forms and overall value structure in order to decipher the compositional strategies used by the artist. My point is, there is not one way to copy. Copies are a valuable study tool, no matter how they're done, and it's up to you to decide what forms of copying is best for your learning process. However you copy, the most important thing is to think about how the artist approached the art-making process, and to attempt to come up with principles that are applicable to your own work. Copying blindly, meaning simply copying without seeking specific answers, might build your dexterity, but will not lead to significant artistic growth. Here is my Capriccio, full of drama and preposterously impossible poses. But I think I learned something about how Goya worked, and also how rusty I am at drawing the figure from my head. Besides the lessons already mentioned, I think the most important lesson is this. Goya's seemingly hasty, expressionistic style hides a tremendous amount of carefully considered choices. And often, wildness in art is actually a carefully calculated act, something rigorously rehearsed and refined until it looks entirely spontaneous. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the rendering techniques of Francisco Goya. If you're new to my channel and enjoyed this video, please subscribe and check out my other videos in this Pen and Ink Lessons from the Masters series. And stay tuned. While these videos do not get the highest views on my channel, they're where I feel I can make the biggest contribution as an art educator, so I plan to make many more. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you back in my messy studio very soon.